So you talk in your book about the importance of emotions. So unpack that a little bit, maybe especially for those of us. I think there's a lot of church culture that kind of tries to suppress emotion or talk about emotion being bad or really treating emotion like a very secondary experience of like, no, we know truth. And so we live by the word of God and truth. And that's very good, obviously. But in those environments, we almost ignore emotion. But you talk about how important emotions are. So unpack
So
that for
important.
us a little bit.
Well, let's start with this. God gave them to us, right? He created emotions. And in Genesis, he looks at creation and says, it is good. So we had emotions before the fall, and he said it is good. So what's their good purpose? Well, I like to say that emotions are messengers. And when we respond to the message, they go away. So if I feel sad or grief, or let's do a really easy one here. Let's take stress, right? If I feel stressed and it's because I'm overdoing it and saying yes to too many things, I respond to that emotion by rescheduling things, getting the courage to make some phone calls or send some texts and say no. That stress should go away. That's how emotions are supposed to work. But a lot of times we try to ignore them or suppress them rather than addressing them. And when we do that, they become what I call sticky emotions. They stick to us, they don't go away because you haven't gotten the message and responded to it. And what happens for us a lot of times when we're in the middle of the beginning of disclosure, the beginning of those ground zero days, I remember just a few days after Bob, I think it might have been the next day, we had guests coming in from the Dominican Republic. We had a wedding to go to. And I'm like putting on the red lipstick and the pretty dress, and I'm just going to pretend everything's okay. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? I was suppressing my emotions. Now, I couldn't, of course, go to the wedding or pick my friends up a mess. Emotions, we started to strangle the loneliness out of our marriage. And you find a couple that has pornography in the home, you will find there's a lot of loneliness in that house. It
Yeah.
might not look like it. They might look pretty functional and pretty picture perfect, but there, you mentioned core lies a moment ago. There are secrets in hearts that have never been discussed and talked about because the shame, which is our deepest, most profound, and hardest to handle emotion, is keeping us from bringing that fear and that lie to the table. And when you can, like, just start to say, this is how I feel, and you're not throwing things, you're not being punitive, you're honestly saying, I need you to understand my emotion. And then the other person says, I need you to understand mine. And you do, you start to strangle the life out of the loneliness that is one of the feeders of pornography. And so I really think they're absolutely essential. Nobody wants to hurt, but pain is a messenger. And when you can figure out the message it's sending, it's kind of like a buoy on top of the surface of the emotions, of your ocean of emotions, saying, here's where the pain is. And you can follow that trail down to the lies, the core lies and beliefs that are down there at the bottom. When you address those and fix those, that's when you start to win the battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you say that emotions are sticky, because I think that's what I missed growing up. Was I learned, kind of at a professional level, to suppress emotions. It was thinking like, oh, I felt all that anger and I managed to suppress it, so now it goes away. And the truth is it doesn't. It's just sticky. And what's happening is it's kind of building for the next time. And then when the anger's stronger and it's like, whoa, until something would happen where I would blow up, or maybe if it was anxiety and stress, until I would just get into kind of full-blown fear and panic mode. Like, that's the buildup of unaddressed emotions. And so I think if we can all grasp, like, the things I'm feeling are sticky, and I'm being given a choice to either pay attention to them, process them, understand where they're coming from, what's driving them, and maybe deal with them at the lowest possible level, if I could put it that way, or to ignore it and have it stick there, and it's going to come back again in another form, and it's probably going to be a little more intense and a little more difficult to deal with. I can wait. And so if we see it that way, maybe we'd get the courage to go, you know what, I'd like to deal with it now, because otherwise it will be sticky and it's
Yeah.
just going to come back again.
And you talk about it in your book as an essential ingredient to intimacy. And intimacy is like knowing and being known. And so, it's that interesting thing. There's a connection I'm making in my mind to the loneliness. It's like you don't know what your spouse, your partner is going through, and they don't know what you're going through. And so there's this fear that, can I actually share what I'm experiencing, or the emotions or some of the fears or some experiences I'm having? And it's easy to talk yourself out of sharing that if it's not, an open environment. We're like, oh, I know that my partner struggles with anxiety. And so if I'm feeling anxious, I know I have that empathy on the other. Want to have intimacy, it has to include our emotions, so we truly know where each other is at.
And when you get to a place where you can communicate really honestly about your emotions, things don't get what I call, they don't become a volcano waiting to explode because
Yeah.
they don't build up.
Yeah.
Months ago, my husband still, it's been many, many years, and he still sees his therapist once a week. He's still in a men's accountability group, and he goes to 12 steps groups because those have been a place where he's actually been able to do some ministry, and it's beautiful. And it's good for him. It keeps him grounded because there's real honesty there. And so I guess maybe 6 or 9 months ago, he said to me, "Baby, I haven't been to 12 step groups for a really long time, and I'm going to start, I think I'm going to go for a while." And I was like, "Oh, awesome. That makes me feel so safe." And he was like, "What?" And I thought you were going to be like, "What's wrong? Did you slip? Like, have you relapsed again?" And I was like, "No, you would tell me if you did." He said, "Yeah, I just have felt a lot of stress and anxiety, and that's always the pathway that leads me to the wrong thing. And I just feel like I need extra cover right now, but I haven't slipped." And so we couldn't have had that conversation before we learned how to talk about emotions.
Yep.
Yeah.
So good.
And at first, conversations like that were messy.
Mm-hmm.
But when we learned the skill of talking about your emotions in a non-emotional way, for him,
That is such an important distinction that I just want to pause and maybe underscore for listeners, that when we talk about our emotions, I think some of us are maybe feeling like, oh, that means vent them, or like I've got to lean into them and feel them fully, and through the emotion tell people how I'm feeling. And someone might say there's a time and a place for that, but I think what I hear you saying and what I've found valuable about emotions is when we kind of figure out that I'm taking a little bit of this observer role of my own emotions, and I'm asking these kind of third-party observation questions of, what am I feeling right now? Where might this be coming from? What might this be connecting to? What did it trigger in me of other, past fears or concerns? And so now I'm analyzing my emotions and understanding them, not just venting them. So when we talk about how important our emotions are to relationship, we don't just mean go home and like have those drag out fights with your spouse because that's the only way to get through the emotion. I mean, in some people, that's maybe their pattern. That's not me, but go for it. I think it's more having that ability with your spouse. Say, here's what I'm feeling, and here's where I think it might be coming from. And what do you, and when you can invite conversation around that, man, I know for my wife and I, that is what makes us feel like, well, I feel like I'm getting to know you better. I have an understanding of you that I maybe didn't before. And so if that's helpful for anyone, I wanted to make that observation because I think we maybe miss that in when we talk about emotions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And healthy emotions aren't uncontrolled.
Right.
Healthy emotions are emotions you acknowledge and understand. And then you say, all right, that's great, but you're not the boss of me. Jesus tells us to take every thought captive to be around. And so it really does require some learning because we've learned so many bad habits in our culture of just like, can we just talk about triggers for a second? Because it's an emotion, I think. But what I have learned is that a trigger where I mean, they're real. Oh, I've had them. Every wife of a porn addict has understands triggers. They're very painful. They're a rough ride. But when I learned to handle my emotions, I started to see triggers as an invitation from the Holy Spirit, because there was a place that I wasn't yet healed. And that trigger was alerting me, oh, let's go deep here, because with God's help, I don't have to be controlled by this trigger anymore. I've been alerted to where a problem is. Let's go figure out what it is. And what a beautiful, people are so afraid of triggers. And honestly, let me be empathetic for a minute. There were times in my journey where I did have to avoid them because they were too painful and I wasn't well enough at the time to handle them. But don't stay there. I invite you to come away from that space. Come to a place where you're in the driver's seat of your emotions.
And if you look at emotions as information, but not the driver, then there's something that you can act like upon. It's something you can move toward and figure out. But if it's something that's taking control, there's not really much you can do. It's kind of running amok.